Thank you for coming tonight. By a show of hands, have any of you been to the Arctic? Great. Well, and for the rest of you, I'm going to try and bring you there for the next hour. But I've had the pleasure to return again and again over the years. So, as you probably know, this evening, if we could bring down the house lights a little bit, it's okay if you have them on me, but if you bring them down on the audience, the pictures will show up a little better. So, as you know, I'm going to be discussing climate change, which has now reached crisis proportions in the Arctic. But I'd also like to call your attention to the subtitle of my book, which is Witnessing Wonder, because most of my time in the far north has been about experiencing beauty again and again. And I hope that if you take anything away from this presentation this evening, it'll be a new perspective on the beauty of the far north, its people, and the wildlife. So I'm going to be discussing tremendous change from nearly 40 years in the Arctic. And you might be curious about this kind of landscape, which I'll explain more about as we go along. This kind of transformation in the landscape, this thawing of this hillside, like spinach, frozen spinach left out on the counter, you can see again and again. So I'll be talking a great deal tonight about change. For me, it all began in 1983 when I was a Denali National Park Service ranger, and I began to learn about the wilderness of Alaska. But when I look back at this picture, I think, who is this person? Talk about change. So that year, 1983, on a Park Service exchange patrol, I flew north into Gates of the Arctic National Park, the first time I'd been north of the Arctic Circle, to do this exchange patrol with a backcountry ranger, Dave Buchanan. And as you can see, during that last week of August in 1983, we never thought about swimming in the river. There were no bugs that time of year. It was just cold. It was winter, in fact. You can see that Dave is dressed in his winter clothing. This is America's greatest swath of wilderness. There's 13 million acres of legislated wilderness between this park, Gates of the Arctic National Park, and the adjoining Noatak National Preserve, also managed by the Park Service. That's over 20,000 square miles of legislated wilderness. Then there's the wildlife. In case you're wondering what a migrating caribou herd sounds like. So the western Arctic caribou herd migrates through in the spring and the fall. And we were surrounded by hundreds, maybe even thousands of animals. They were being chased by bears and wolves. We watched a grizzly bear consume a caribou. We found a wolf den with 5 pups. Just simply amazing wildlife encounters. Needless to say, it really changed my life. And I quit the Park Service shortly thereafter. And for the next 39 years, would continue making trips to the north. So it's important for our purposes tonight to try to see the Arctic from the top of the world rather than as we might normally see it from our southern biosphere. There's 7 countries with land that pokes up above the Arctic Circle. That's that somewhat arbitrary line here, which you can see dotted here in this circle at 66 degrees, 33 minutes north. There are 4 million people that live in these 7 countries, mostly in Russia. We have about 250,000 above the Arctic Circle in North America. That includes about 50,000 in Alaska. Collectively, most of these people who live on the roof of North America are referred to as Inuit. In Alaska, they prefer to be called Inupiat. which both words mean the people. And although most of them live what some people down south might mistakenly perceive as being in a welfare state, they still live proud lives close to the land and close to the wildlife. In fact, many of the elders still teach their children that they share the same souls as the animals. And it's very tough. This is the first time I saw a whale being butchered. It's a beluga whale. I was alone, and they welcomed me into their hunting camp. And it's tough to see this happening, but the people of the North have never accounted for the eradication of any of the animals that they share the North with. I want to call your attention to those knives they're using. I'm going to talk about those again. One of the many things that makes the Arctic unique and quite different from where we live is that it's entirely underlain by permafrost. And sometimes this permafrost is solid ice, like you see here, but it's mostly frozen soil. And it can plunge as deep as a mile below the surface of the earth. And as early as the 1980s, I saw many places like this, particularly along the coastline, where the permafrost was being exposed and thawing, particularly along the coastline because the lack of land-fast sea ice that protects the coast allowed the waves to beat away and expose the shore. So after nearly a dozen trips to different places in the Arctic, I determined to set out on a long trip across the Arctic. And I started here in the Mackenzie River Delta in Northwest Territories, Canada, and would paddle nearly 500 miles alone. And I decided that if I could handle it alone, that I would return to the Mackenzie Delta and then go east and try to cross all the way from the Pacific tides to the Atlantic tides. Largely alone, and occasionally, sometimes as far as 400 miles apart, passing through these villages, where I began to learn even more about the Arctic from the people. So I started the second year, 1998, going east from the Mackenzie River Delta when the sea ice was still frozen. This is April, and headed out alone. And to be honest, it was really quite a frightening thing to leave these villages alone every time. But at least on this particular part of the voyage, I had my dog with me. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of film from a documentary that I made.
We live in a busy world where there's no time to reflect and to slow down and see the world on slower terms. And by being alone, by being shut off from radio and TV and telephone and the hubbub of a busy and productive life, you can come to a new understanding about the natural world.
So every time I watch this clip, I'm transported back into that kind of state of timeless wonder, exposed to this incredible, vast place surrounding me. When the sea ice melted in July, I continued alone in a kayak, and I'm paddling past what is known as land-fast ice here. And this land-fast ice began disappearing along the coastlines of the Beaufort Sea as early as 3 decades ago. And again, this is the ice that protects the shoreline and protects villages. This Beaufort Sea coastline is the fastest eroding coastline in the world because of the diminishing sea ice. So on many trips to the north, I took it upon myself to learn everything I could about the animals. And this is one of the most extraordinary animals, a remnant of the last ice age, the muskox, which is actually a member of the goat family. But they're left over from the ice age nearly 12,000 years ago. But it really pays when you're alone, particularly traveling alone in such a place, to pay attention, to use your binoculars or to get closer. And here you can see these muskoxen are actually guarding their calf. Or here, I learned from my time as a park ranger and from numerous encounters with grizzly bears that this was a 2-year-old male grizzly. And you're wondering how I knew that. Well, I took a lot of pictures so I could explain. But I knew it was a 2-year-old male because it was following its mother. And if it was 3 years old or older, it wouldn't have been with its mother. And I knew that it was a male because of the way it was peeing. Females pee backwards and males pee straight down. So this is the kind of obsessive compulsive behavior that I subscribe to. But this kind of thing might well have kept me thriving and maybe even helped me survive. I also took the trouble to learn the Latin names of animals, and here's a little bit more footage from that documentary film.
Ursus horribilis. Be a bad thing to get on a rogue wave right now and ride it into shore. It's coming over to check me out. Hello, Mr. Bear. It's the second bear I've seen in an hour's time, and I'm obviously coming into the barren ground grizzly habitat. Lots of ground squirrels, lots of good grays, probably young caribous around. There's a muskoxen off in the distance here, so I'm going to have to be real careful with camp tonight. Damned if he isn't swimming after me.
So, as you can guess, the bear didn't catch me. I wouldn't be standing here tonight. But I knew that bears are ungainly, grizzly bears anyways, are ungainly swimmers, which is not true of polar bears, which really had me awake at night. But I still wonder today what would have happened if I waited for this bear to catch up to me. I was particularly enchanted by bird life. There are over 200 species of birds in the Arctic. This is a bird that we have here also in the Colorado Rockies, the rock ptarmigan, which is one of the few birds that sticks around for the winter when it turns all white. And its call is also unmistakable if you've heard it before. So, of course, there wouldn't be so many birds if there wasn't another species to feed them.
Breathing in a mixture of bugs and air, Jon is left to contemplate the karmic benefits of consuming a little extra protein.
So I finished that particular 2,200-mile journey in September, out in the Atlantic tides in a place called the Gulf of Boothia. And I had run into a couple of polar bears, but I rounded a point and surprised this polar bear that jumped into the water. It was actually eating a seal on an iceberg and started swimming after me. And at first I started paddling away, and I quickly realized that this was a grave mistake, because there's no way you can out-paddle a polar bear. So I turned and faced the bear, put my paddle down, and took a quick photograph here. And it worked. The bear turned around, realized that I wasn't a prey species because I was no longer fleeing. As the bear clambered back out onto this iceberg, I gave it a great bow of respect, and that was the end of my journey. But the polar Inuit know this polar bear as Tanorsuk, the one who gives power. They think of it as a mythical being, and I could understand those feelings as I bowed to the bear. And then after I shot this shaky video footage, it seemed to disappear right in front of my eyes, like the mythical beast of legend. So I continued taking more trips to the Arctic. In 2006, I led an expedition for the National Geographic, mainly to investigate climate change in Arctic Alaska. And I was traveling with a renowned field biologist, wildlife biologist, Dr. George Schaller. We were celebrating the 50th anniversary of his study in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And here you can see we're at that 66 degrees, 33 minutes north, that imaginary line that goes through the Arctic. And so we're passing the last of the trees as we head up onto the north slope of Alaska. In 2004, fires burned from horizon to horizon in the Alaskan Arctic, just 2 years before this trip. And they burned right on into the fall. And if fires that size had burned anywhere in the lower 48, they would have been really catastrophic. But because there's really no people here in the Arctic, they just let them burn. And then again, in 2005, the fires in the Arctic caused the greatest smoke event in the history of Alaska. And what's unusual about these fires is that historically, through the fossil records, even beyond our own historic records, we know that fires were a very rare thing in the Arctic in the distant past over the millennia. This, incidentally, is fireweed, which is the first species to come in usually after a fire, after the land is burned. But I have to add that there are countless moments of wonder, even amid potential devastation like this, with George here looking at the flowers. Further north, we stopped at a scientific research station called the Toolik Lake Research Station, and a plant ecologist there took us out to a greenhouse that had been set up nearly a dozen years earlier. And effectively, this warmed the inside of that polyethylene tarp several degrees. And you can see that the species here, which is normally ankle to knee high, dwarf birch, inside the greenhouse is now chest and head high. And this is what scientists refer to as the Arctic feedback loop, or the greening of the Arctic. And this is what is occurring throughout the circumpolar Arctic. As the Arctic warms, the sea ice diminishes, the tree line, the trees and the brush are moving north. That year, in 2006, among many trips, we crossed over the Brooks Range, paddled the river to the sea, and then paddled 60 miles to the Inupiat village of Kaktovik. This is a coastline that I'd passed before in the past, but this was remarkably changed this year because of the melt-off, the lack of the land-fast sea ice. These bluffs are all thawing, and you can see, you might be able to just make out the water pouring off the thawing permafrost ice. So I took several more trips, but in 2001, I returned to the Noatak River after now a 36-year absence. And the river, however, was strangely flooded. In fact, we had to wait 3 days to fly in because it rained so hard. I'd never seen this kind of flooding. And in addition to my Park Service patrol of more than 3 decades previous, I had guided this river for a couple of years in the mid-'80s. And this was just beyond my past experience. I brought my 15-year-old son with me, Alistair, that year, 2021, ostensibly to share the wonders of the Arctic, but it became about something else. It became about this extraordinary change. The place was brushy in a way that I'd never experienced before. The wolf den I discovered so long ago was long gone and brushed over. And you can see that my son cooking a grayling here. It's so hot out that not only were we swimming in the river, but it was so hot out we had to tilt the raft on its side for some shade just to get out of the sun. It was nearly 90 degrees. And again, 36 years earlier, we never dreamed of swimming in the river. So we know now that the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the Earth. Here you can see on this map from one of my National Geographic books, the Noatak National Preserve, adjacent to Gates of the Arctic National Park, where Alistair and I finished our trip. That area, I'll tell you, rather than having you try to study this graphic, has warmed 6 degrees Fahrenheit on average over the last half century. And that's extraordinary warming for a place that is normally cold. Alistair and I saw only one caribou in that 100-mile trip, where in the past saw many, many caribou everywhere. So it's not just that there are fewer caribou, but of course their migration seasons are changing as the summer starts earlier and ends later. But across the circumpolar Arctic, that is around the world in the Arctic, caribou herds everywhere are diminishing because of habitat loss and climate change. So after what I experienced in 2021, I decided to go back and investigate more carefully. So we were flown in to Walker Lake here in the southern part of Gates of the Arctic National Park. And my companion and I would then climb over the Brooks Range, find the very headwaters of the Noatak River, and then paddle in our pack rafts nearly over 400 miles to the sea, stopping in Noatak Village, meeting with the scientists along the way, then eventually making our way to the Chukchi Sea and traveling another 80 miles along the Chukchi Sea coastline to finally to the village of Kivalina. And you can see from the map that we were traveling through 3 different National Park Service lands, including Cape Krusenstern National Monument. So from Walker Lake, my companion Chris Korbulik and I made our way up Kalulutuk Creek, which would be called a river anywhere else in the world. But we're looking at these extraordinary landslides here, which are known as thermokarst, caused by the thawing of permafrost. And this is a phenomenon I'll show you more about, but they're occurring across the Arctic. And from here, it took us 4 days to reach a pass, which would give us access to the headwaters of the Noatak. Now, this is a completely trailless place. We didn't see signs of any other humans. Chris took this picture from the top of the pass, and you can just make me out there in the green jacket. I'm actually scooping some ice water because I doused myself with bear spray, so I'm trying to cool myself down. So my first mistake on this expedition was arranging to climb over the Brooks Range. Why couldn't we have just started in the Noatak River? But here's what we saw from that amazing area on top of the pass.
The gig pack and the clouds over there, some other unnamed jagged peaks. It's all around. And the sun is coming out. It is just so beautiful out here. It's hard to leave. I don't want to leave. But we gotta go down. We gotta make progress. Got a long way downstream to go.
So you can just make out the first silver thread of a tiny stream, which is the Noatak River, coming off the glaciers in these incredible limestone and granite turreted peaks in the Brooks Range. Again, not a soul around, not a human soul around. So the headwaters of the Noatak at this point are mostly permafrost meltwater and glacial water. As we walked amid a veritable arboretum of fireweed, also known as river beauty, cinquefoil, and the boykinia, which is also called the bear flower. And I would venture to guess that a lot of you don't know that bears are not really big meat eaters. More than 90% of their diet is plant matter, and this is one of the things they seek out. They have a nose for protein-rich plants like the boykinia. So it's lovely to run a river from its source to the sea. I've had the opportunity to do this repeatedly with big and small rivers around North America. Every time I've done it, it's like making a new friend. And my second mistake on this expedition was choosing an expedition partner, Chris Korbulik, who happened to be one of the world's most accomplished expedition kayakers and more than 30 years younger than me. So this was a typical scene at the end of the day. I'm utterly spent while my companion is wandering around indefatigably with his camera, taking pictures. We saw red foxes, which only used to range as far as tree line, but now have moved up to the tundra regions of the Arctic and even over the Brooks Range as far as the Arctic Ocean and the Beaufort Sea, as the temperatures have continued to warm, and they're displacing and dominating the species normally found there along the shoreline of the Arctic Ocean, the Arctic fox. We had a nylon bellows bag, and I can't tell you how relieved we were to get the 9-pound pack rafts off our backs and inflate them with that nylon bag. And then down the river we went, bumping off rocks in that beautiful turquoise water, just taking in everything that surrounded us. So this is one of the many scenes which begins to explain why I subtitled my book, Witnessing Wonder. The Arctic is just such a vast place. It takes a long time to figure out what you're looking at because there are no visual cues. There are no trees or buildings or trails or generally no people around. And that vastness becomes, the light too, just become hypnotic. So I felt both humbled and exhilarated for every new vista that opened up before us. We were alone, unheated, and felt really in a state of awe as we let the current pull us slowly to the sea. Not all was nirvana. Here, scouting the headwaters, it's a much brushier place, as I said earlier, but we're also surrounded in this wildfire haze. 3 million acres burned that summer of 2022. Here you can see a map that shows the carbon monoxide output in Alaska that wafted out over the Arctic. It's a tough time to be breathing the air, but eventually we got out of it. And this is the kind of thing that draws me back year after year, just these vast horizons out of the wildfire haze, obviously, the far shore seeming like nearly a mile away. So the now frequently flooding Noatak and other Arctic rivers like it work away at the banks and expose this ancient permafrost. They've found permafrost in North America as old as 660,000 years old. This is ancient ice. They often find mastodons sticking out of this ice. So you could literally touch and even smell the Pleistocene here as we stopped this ice. That's rock hard ice. You can throw, you could probably shoot it with a gun and the bullet would barely penetrate it. It's been frozen for thousands and thousands of years. So it's really quite dreamy seeing this, where this ancient permafrost is exposed, even though it's emblematic of this radical change sweeping across the north. But being here just put us both into an entirely different mindset as we continued downstream. So most of what we know about this permafrost comes from the Russians because much of northern Russia is underlain by permafrost. And they refer to the ground that is not frozen on top of the permafrost as talc. And here in the 1950s in this National Park Service map, you see that there's no unfrozen ground, 70 years ago, 60, 70 years ago. But fast forward the clock to 15, 20 years ago, and the thawing ground has spread north. And if we were to have this map remade now, you would see much of these park units are now unfrozen on top of the permafrost. And this is what you see when the permafrost thaws, these thermal karsts. This is the cover of my book, and this is what much of the north is beginning to look and sound like. So these sluice canals are freighting all that melting mud and slush down to the river, and below these thermal karsts, the river turned ashen gray for several miles at least. For a sense of scale, you can just make out the canoe there in the distance, which is propelled by a scientist whom we traveled with for a week. And here, my good friend, Professor Gary Kofinas, explains what this thawing Earth is.
Located a thermokarst site. Thermokarst being a place where the permafrost is thawing at an accelerating rate and causing erosion on the hillside. It's no accident that this one is south-facing, because it gets the exposure of the sun from the south, the low-angle sun here in Arctic Alaska. As I look behind me, I can see the layer of vegetation on top, and under that, what's called the active layer. So that's the layer at the very surface that thaws every year during the summer months, and below that, soil. And below that, you see this light gray layer, which is permafrost. That is a hard surface. I just threw a rock at it, and it bounced off of it. So that is this area has started as a small area that has started to thaw and erode and grown and grown to this area where we have movement of silty mud that's moving into the river and growing, and it'll do this all the way until things start to freeze again, and they continue again next year and get more and more large.
So this is not a benign phenomenon, these thermokarsts, because they silt up the rivers and cause all kinds of damages, not only for people who want to fish in the river, for these Inupiat villages, but who knows what kind of harm it's causing to aquatic life. After Professor Kofinas flew out, we spent another week alone paddling downriver, and then ran into some, wouldn't you know it, fish ecologists from Europe, from Austria. And we spent a night camp with them, and they caught some salmon. These are chum salmon, and I caught some grayling, and we had a feast. But this is an interesting little episode, because it shows these people have, these two guys, these fish ecologists, they've come from halfway around the world, not only to experience this wilderness, which they don't have in Europe anymore, not nearly at this scale, nor do they have the salmon. So in sushi restaurants, ikura, or red caviar, is over $30 a plate at my favorite sushi restaurant. But here in the wilds of the Arctic, we had all we could eat for free. Our European companions were also very fond of fish head soup. And since it was a cold day, they threw in lots of chili into this fish head soup, which is not exactly to my taste. So I mentioned the greening of the Arctic occurring throughout the north, the shrubs moving north. And this is a photograph that I recolored from more than a century ago on the Noatak River. And I found the exact spot where this photograph was taken and rephotographed it. And you can see that it's a much greener place than it was a century ago. These trees, these poplars, which didn't exist a century ago or even 50 years ago, were over our heads, as well as most of these willows and dwarf birch here. So to look at that again, the past and the present. So you're probably asking yourself, is this change, this greening of the Arctic, a good or a bad thing? Because on the one hand, forests and plant matter acts as carbon sinks. But in this instance, it's not really doing any good for the Arctic, because all these trees are actually bringing warmth down into the ground and warming that permafrost. So there's a net loss from this greening of the Arctic. And as I'll explain momentarily, there are other effects caused by the greening of the Arctic too. Since the river was flooding, we frequently had to be careful because we were pushed right through the forests. Or in other places, you see this other phenomenon which is occurring even down in the subarctic, known as a drunken forest effect. And as you can imagine, the permafrost thaws beneath the forest, and the trees are literally losing the roots are losing their foundation, and the trees are falling over. So yet another example of the net loss. The trees are struggling to even survive. So seen here through the wildfire haze, an aerial view of the lower Noatak River, the amazing river, quite channeled, as you can see. This is the village of Noatak, population about 400. And because the river's now flooding, they've lost one of their roads, and the river's now impeding upon the airstrip, which is their crucial supply line. So across the north, the permafrost thaw has repercussions along with a diminishing sea ice. But here you see this house all cattywampus because the permafrost has thawed underneath it and actually broken the sewage and the water pipelines to this man's home. But I've never met such a generous and hospitable people as the Inupiat and the Inuit. They took us sight unseen, unknown, into their homes and fed us and put us up, got us out of the mosquitoes, and then trounced us in games of rummy cube. So Christian missionaries forbade the Inupiat and the Inuit people from speaking English about a century ago, which is really one of the great tragedies, because the Inuktitut and Inupiaq languages are have such precise nuances to describe the animals and the landscape in a way that would take sentences to do in English. But make no mistake about it, these people still are very connected to the land. This man, Ricky Ashby, was showing off this fur jacket that he made and the mukluk boots, and he has an Inupiat Eskimo dictionary that he's made so that he doesn't forget these noble words of his ancestors. And that earlier image of the woman butchering the whale, they were using ulus, invented, one of the many things invented by their culture thousands and thousands of years ago. And this tool has been passed down among the generations, primarily used by the woman. And the symbolic value of it is that they're passing their knowledge on down to the next generation by passing down the ulu knife. This woman is chopping up a plant known as sourdock, which is also known as Eskimo spinach. In Noatak village, they told us about how the willows had recently grown so high they couldn't see the mountains upriver. And they told us about the moose that had started coming in greater numbers. They also told us about the beavers polluting the water, apparently changing the fish populations. And like the moose, these beavers are drawn by this new greenery, by this greening of the Arctic, because they eat the willows and in turn use those willows as dam material. So as you see, this is a satellite photograph from 2003. It's a tributary of the Noatak River. And fast forward the clock more than a dozen years later, and you see that beavers have totally transformed the ecosystem and created their dams. Now, normally, beavers belong in most ecosystems, but here in the north, those bodies of water are effectively warming the part, they hold the heat and they warm the surrounding permafrost ground. Just in this small area of northwest Arctic Alaska, they've counted over 11,000 new beaver dams since 1980. We resupplied in the bustling town of Kotzebue out on the Chukchi seacoast. And this has been a center for Inupiat trade for thousands and thousands of years, with a hospital, other government services that bring the people in from the surrounding villages like Noatak. So here in this map from my book, you can see our entire 500-mile route from Walker Lake all the way down to the sea, and then our final leg, another 80 miles along the coastline to Kivalina. What could possibly go wrong, we thought? Just another 80 miles down a hard, compacted beach. But traveling north to Kivalina proved to be somewhat of a nightmare because the lack of landfast sea ice meant that the storms had thrown up all this soft sand, and you can see how we're forced to break trail here while dragging a sled and a cart. We would blow up our pack rafts to paddle across the rivers that we encountered. You can see this cart. We actually used baling wire to strap on flotsam, thinking that it would give these bicycle tires more flotation in the loose sand, but it didn't really do us any good. Despite more than a few incoming rivers and streams, we had a couple of dry camps, and I scooped up some water in my water filter here just from permafrost melt puddles. And in retrospect, it probably wasn't a good idea because what we're looking at are minerals, probably iron from the permafrost. And over the last few years in this very region in northwest Arctic Alaska, dozens of rivers have begun to turn orange with this permafrost thaw, fluorescent orange like this. So you can guess what this would do to the aquatic life, never mind to the drinking water for the villages. We were seeing dead birds like this gull, and over the last decade, they have counted over 1 million dead seabirds on the coastlines of Alaska. That's exponentially many times that of previous decades. And this is caused by what scientists call blob events. These blob events are warming ocean events in the Bering Sea and the Pacific Ocean that force the food that these seabirds depend upon down deep where they can't eat it. They starve to death, and many of them are washed ashore. So by the time we finished our expedition, after several more brutal days of walking and dragging our sled and cart, we both injured our backs. What could possibly go wrong, we told ourselves. But the difficulties we had were nothing in comparison to that which the Inupiat people are facing, particularly here in the village of Kivalina. You can see this island village is surrounded by the sea. The Army Corps of Engineers recently built this road just a few years ago so that the people can evacuate to higher ground. They estimate that the village would be inundated by the end of this year. They have built a seawall, but this scant protection would just give them a few more hours to scoot across that road to really nothing on the other side of the road. So now, when I think about the Arctic, I often think about the children. I think about people's adaptability, which always amazed me. Without swing sets or playgrounds or seesaws, they'll play on a bowhead whale jawbone like these boys here in Noatak Village. Or how the people thousands of years ago invented the predecessor of the trampoline when they threw people up and down on sealskins so they could spot whales out in the ocean. These kind-hearted and noble people have adapted for many millennia to the changing wilderness of the Arctic. But how will they adapt as they're forced to move from their villages with changing and diminishing animals that they depend upon for food security? So this is a place that's dear to my heart, and I wonder in 20 years if my children will even be able to travel on the sea ice like I was able to do. Already the Kimmick, or the Eskimo husky, is on the verge of extinction, being replaced by the snow machine. And how will the Inupiat, like this man here in his caribou skin jacket, continue to live with these conditions changing as they have? Will he still witness the myriad beauties that he can still witness today? So I'll leave you with the first 2 pages of my book for wherever you might go, whether in the local wilderness or hopefully again or anew to the Arctic, with the words from the esteemed author E.B. White. Always be on the lookout for the presence of wonder. That's all. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jon Waterman.
Have you, when you went through the gates of the Arctic there's a proposed road service for a proposed mine, and that was delayed. Did you have any further information about that development? Yeah,
that's the proposed Ambler Road to open up a proposed mine, a copper mine, near the village of Ambler. And it would cut through gates of the Arctic National Preserve, the section of the park. It would cross the Kobuk River and scores of other watersheds, potentially block the movement of the caribou herd. And the Biden administration shut down the road just in the last couple of months. But who knows what will happen in the coming years and whether this road will be, the idea will be reopened. I'm obviously opposed to it.
There we go.
When were you last up at the pole area, roughly? What year?
Pardon?
When were you last up north of the pole area? And my only question really has to do with, we have roughly, from what I read, somewhere between 1.5 billion to 2 billion metric tons of carbon trapped under the permafrost, including methane. So as this methane, begins moving up, it's destroying more of the environment up there as well. But I just wonder if you were really exposed to any of the methane or could notice the implication of it up there.
Well, I suppose you'd have to have a gas meter to notice that the emissions of the methane from the permafrost as well as the carbon dioxide. There was a distinctive fennel smell to exposed permafrost. But these things are really, for the most part, invisible, this outgassing.
Jon, while the gears keep turning, are you seeing ripple effects from what you see in the Arctic to the rest of the planet?
The rest of the planet? Well, since the Arctic is a frozen place, we're seeing many of the same things that we see in the lower 48. For instance, they never had lightning storms there, but now there are lightning storms north of the Arctic Circle. So there are now forest fires up there. But the difference about the Arctic in addition to it warming 4 times faster than the rest of the world, is that this permafrost is thawing and the sea ice is diminishing. So it's a much more accelerated condition than the rest of the planet, with the exception of Antarctica.
Tell us a little bit about how you supplied yourself as you traveled, how far you went on a typical day, if there was such a thing.
Well, in a sea kayak, I could get approximately a month's worth of food and supplies in my sea kayak, but I mostly go with freeze-dried food because it's the most condensed and lightweight food I can carry. But you can also, I don't like to fish because it tends to draw in bears. In a pack raft, like my most recent expedition, you can get probably, with 2 people, you could probably last for a month and a half. There's an enormous amount of stowage in the tubes of those pack rafts. So resupply really isn't a problem. And when you run out of food, you get to a village, and then it's easy to resupply. Well, the furthest distance I ever had to travel was in my sea kayak, 400 miles from one village to another. And I'd pretty much run out of food after 400 miles. It took me over a month. And there are other places in the Arctic, depending on where you're traveling, where you could travel that far too.
John, we've got an online question. In your years, are you noticing an increase in the number of expeditions and explorers? Is there any human impact in these areas, or are you still really in solitude when you're there?
It's one of the great things about the Arctic is you can really, it's so vast, and there are so many challenges. For instance, the mosquitoes, that it doesn't draw a lot of people north. So it's easy to be alone. And no, I haven't really noticed a real increase in people. They're on the Noatak. I think the Noatak has generally become a more popular river because it's one of the wild and scenic rivers. But most of the people stay in the headwaters of the river rather than continuing all the way down.
Do you use, nowadays when you go up there, do you use drones to help take pictures and photography? And the other question is, back in the 80s and 90s when you were heading up there, who was taking those pictures, or how were you taking those pictures when you were by yourself? You and your dog, or just by yourself?
Yeah, good question. I had some Inupiat hunters snap some shots for me. And we did use a drone outside the village of Kivalina to get that one aerial photo of Kivalina, but I generally don't use drones. You can't use them in National Park Service lands, so we didn't carry one with us on that 2022 expedition.
There was another question online, and it's about the power of photography. So there's a local photographer here named Todd Winslow Pierce, who has a project that focuses on conservation, using photography to support land conservation efforts. Have you, over your career, how has the relationship between the cause and your art evolved?
Well, I can only speak for myself. I've taken pictures all my life, and initially I used my photographs and continue to use them as memory tools, much like I write in a journal. And I find that I take out my pictures and they evoke scenes and memories I might otherwise forget or not record in my journal. But I think photographs are very powerful exemplars of the change. The photograph on the cover of my book shows this massive thawing permafrost. And I think that we can use both images and video to show these radical changes and hopefully affect climate change legislation and cause greater public outreach and understanding and education.
I forgot how to hold it, but
You're ready. You're good. You got this.
okay. I'm thinking of the native cultures that live there, and I'm wondering how their populations are doing with not only the environment, but education and disease. And we've found a lot in some of our Native American populations, their art and culture is really stressed because a lot of the youth are leaving because they're thinking there's bigger opportunities outside of their villages. And I just wondered how you felt the Native population is actually doing.
Well, it's a big and an important question. Thank you. First off, you have to understand, and you may be aware of this already, but just allow me to say that in Alaska, they did it differently. And rather than putting native populations onto reservations, they allowed them to create native corporations. There are 13 native corporations. And those native corporations, depending on the tribe and the region of Alaska, all benefit from investments, usually in resources, i.e. oil, zinc mines, etc. So again, it's a big question. The people generally don't leave their villages because they're very tight, family-oriented, and their culture, as much as you might think they're assimilated, their culture is still very intact. So it's very difficult for them to leave. Some go out and get an education, but most come back. And their art and culture is very alive. You know, for instance, in the Canadian Arctic, the carvings are just otherworldly and beautiful, as well as other art that they create, the sewing, the mittens they make out of muskoxen underfur. So I tend to think of the people, at least in the Alaskan North and also in Nunavut in northern Canada, as having a different opportunity and being culturally intact.
Thank you so much for your presentation. You know, you kind of embarrass us that live here in this beautiful area with the hiking and all the biking and everything we do, and you're going 400 miles, and we're just figuring if we do 10 miles, we're doing a good day. So, very impressed. Could you share with us the effects as best you can project based on this climate change, what's really going to go on in the Arctic in years to come?
I can't say. I've always been loath to subscribe to these predictions. There are so many wild cards. For instance, the off-gassing of the methane from the permafrost. There's as much methane contained in the permafrost as exists anywhere else in the world. And so that's just one wild card. I don't know what will happen. I know I'm hopeful. I'm not a doomsayer, and I believe that the earth will endure. However, we have to really look after this culture. And as I said, there are 50,000 people, mostly Native Americans, who live north of the Arctic Circle in Alaska. And that to me, is the real potential crisis, is just to safeguard these people and to relocate them when necessary. I wish I could say more about the future, but I don't know.
Do you have an estimate of how much it will cost to relocate Kivalina?
Yeah, relocating Kivalina, Kivalina is an interesting place because, and I deliberately chose to go there because 20 years ago, the village brought suit against a half dozen oil companies because they believed that the oil companies not only withheld the dangers of climate change, but caused it. And they asked for $400 million in damages, which essentially would be the amount that they need to relocate the village. And that's one village. That's one village among approximately 36 in Alaska and northern Alaska that need to be relocated, that are in imminent danger of inundation by the sea or rivers. Unfortunately, they lost in the lower court, and they appealed to a higher court, and it was thrown out of court. But now the state of California is suing the oil companies as well. So the Inupiat have given us a lot of things. They've given us the igloo, and the harpoon, and snow goggles, and snowshoes, and dog sleds, and now they've shown us how to sew. So they might have started something there.
John, this one's from me. My kids are 9 and 12, and I was so heartened to see that photo of your son and that you were able to take that trip with him. I wonder how those experiences have transformed his journey, and I wonder for those of us with kids or grandkids that are coming up in the world, what would your message be to that next generation about why it's so important to understand these changes?
Well, there's a lot of climate grief going around, and particularly for the younger generation, among other things. But that is probably top 3 for the younger generation. And my message is the same, is to seek out wonder, seek out the beauties of the earth, and all is not lost. Again, the earth will endure. Get out there and learn from the earth. And that's what I did by taking my son north, and that's what I'll continue to do with him as long as I can.
It feels like it could be a mission statement for our community here. Other questions? I knew there were some out there. I'll come to you next.
You showed one caribou. I'm just wondering what is going to happen to the caribou. How many there are, and are they stable or losing?
Well, the Western Arctic herd that I showed you pictures of is the largest herd in the U.S. And 24 years ago, they were 500,000, and the latest census puts them at 152,000. So it's diminished by 2/3. But let me hasten to add that caribou populations have always risen and fallen cyclically, depending on cycles of weather, etc. However, I hasten to add again that across the circumpolar Arctic, the only caribou population I know of that's actually grown is the porcupine caribou herd in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And other than that, the populations in Canada are crashing, and there's been a lot of press about that in Canada because of habitat loss, because of climate change. And what's going to happen, I can't say. How do we replace these caribou? And of course, they're prey species. They're important keystone species for other animals that depend upon them, let alone the people who depend upon them. It's food security for many of the people in the north.
I'm interested in their clothing. You alluded to the fact that they sew many things from animal hides. What do they use for supplies for sewing? What do you use for thread? For scissors to cut things? Is there any clothing flown in? What's that all about?
Well, we actually brought donations from Eddie Bauer. We brought tens of thousands of dollars worth of clothing for each of the villages that we visited. And that's what I've done in the past from other companies like the Patagonia and the North Face. But these make no mistake, these are sophisticated people. They travel outside their villages. Not a lot. They always hasten to return to their villages. So they have all the amenities. They have satellite TV. They might go home and watch the same programs that we watch tonight. So they have all the supplies they need. I mean, they're threatened in places like No Attack because their airstrip might soon be flooded. But they're incredibly resilient and adaptable people. Very different from the Eskimos in the past. They have adapted to the modern age in most ways.
Yes. Were you ever injured or become ill? And how did you communicate with the outside world other than in the villages that you stopped in?
Yes, I was injured, and that's why I'm sitting in a high chair right now. But on my long trip the longest trip I took in the Arctic, 2,200 miles, I mostly traveled alone, and I did not use a satellite phone because I really wanted the journey to be a test of my own self-sufficiency. So I figured that if I broke my leg, then I would have to splint it and get out, that I would have to be careful and take care of myself. But now I found increasingly that all the people I go with have Garmin InReach devices. I still haven't gotten one, but most of my companions have them, and I think it is smart to have an emergency safety device like that. And yes, I had been injured repeatedly and never had to be rescued. I've bear sprayed myself repeatedly. I'm beginning to think that bear spray is more dangerous than shotguns. That's also recounted in this book that I wrote.
Hopefully you didn't see much evidence of human pollution when you were upriver, but when you were kayaking in the ocean, did you see much evidence of like plastics being washed up? Did they find their way through the currents up to those areas that you were in?
You know, in the northern seas, the Beaufort Sea, the Arctic Ocean, there's virtually no flotsam. The Chukchi Sea, I saw a lot more because there's a lot more people around and there's a little bit more commercial boat traffic on the western shore of Alaska. There's, not to keep heaping bad news upon everyone, but they have found extraordinary levels of PCPs in the Arctic Ocean area. And it's absorbed in the blubber of seals and walruses and polar bears, and in turn eaten by the people that eat those animals. But for the most part, very little litter, but I have to explain that the Inuit, you know, historically, you know, their tools were all made from wood or surrounding things, and when their tools broke, they would just leave them on the landscape and they would degrade. But now that they're plastic and metals, they're still in the habit of just chucking those things if they're broken, as their ancestors did. But I generally saw very little litter compared to southern biosphere coastlines.
Yeah, I'm curious if there are real defined international boundaries in the Arctic, and should we be concerned about China and Russia and their designs for that real estate?
Yeah, that's a very pertinent question today. Let me preface it by saying that I've repeatedly paddled across the Canada-Alaska border, and the only one that there were other than some ravens sitting there in a tower at the border, there was no one there to check my passport. But it is a pertinent question because, as you know, the diminishing sea ice is allowing increasing ship traffic. On one of my first trips, long trips in the Beaufort Sea, I saw one of only 2 ships that went through the Northwest Passage that year. And in the last couple of years, there have been dozens, and over a dozen of those dozens of ships have been cargo ships. And in addition to that, it's not only the ships transiting the Northwest Passage where there's diminishing summer sea ice, but of course there's increased mineral exploitation, in particular drilling for oil. The Biden administration recently declared all drilling offshore out of bounds, but that's probably going to change in the next 4 years. And I fear drilling off the north shore of Alaska, let alone on the land itself. But the Russians surely are eyeing potential mineral exploitation, subsurface exploitation.
We've got time for a few more questions. And I know, Jon, this book is just into the world, but I wonder what's next? What's your next big adventure? What's on your horizon?
Well, I felt like I have had a lot of press for this last project and ongoing interviews and podcasts and a recent essay I did in the New York Times, which is all good, but I'm afraid that I'm not really reaching beyond the niche audience, and I want to reach a broader audience. And I'm afraid that it's a difficult time right now, that because of the election, that maybe a lot of people have their heads in the sand, including me. But I feel like this issue, to answer your question in a roundabout way, this issue of climate change in the Arctic is a little bit too remote for most people. So I've decided that I'm going to begin a project investigating climate change in our national parks, which is, there's been a tremendous amount of research done in most of our parks, and the people that are doing the research are fascinating people themselves. So I thought it might be a more immediate and wider reaching way to address the perils of climate change.
I think it was about a quarter of the room had been to the Arctic. Quick hand in the air if you've been to one of our national parks.
See,
in Vail,
there you go.
I'd expect 100% of the hands for that one. And I'll give you a plug here as well. If you think this presentation is important and you have friends and neighbors in the community who aren't here tonight, Jon will be back in March under the umbrella of Walking Mountains, and that's at Colorado Mountain College on March 13th, if I've got that correct.
That's correct, yeah, thank you.
So please help spread the word, and we may not be able to deliver for you a national audience, but we can certainly give you more of Eagle County.
Thank you.
Jon, as someone who lives on the western slope here and is really familiar with the Colorado mountains and environment, what have your observations looked like here? How does that parallel to these adventures in the Arctic?
Just strictly in the context of adventures?
In the context of climate observation.
Well, I spent a lot of time researching water issues, in particular on the Colorado River with the National Geographic. And I'm sad to say that when I did that work more than a dozen years ago, that it seemed to me the answers were right there at our fingertips. It just demanded some very serious conservation, and that hasn't happened. And that is very much a climate change issue, that the diminishing water in our watersheds is all about changing climate. But I can tell you that I moonlight with a plow, a snow plow, and this is the second winter I haven't had to plow in the town of Carbondale yet. And I ski a great deal, but the snow, there's still plenty of snow in the mountains, but we're concerned, of course, I'm sure you're concerned about the future of snow in the mountains.
Yeah. Yeah.
In one of the opening slides, you showed the map at 66 degrees and 33 minutes, and above the Arctic Circle is an awful lot of Greenland. And with your comment about commercial shipping and perhaps Russian interests in mineral resources, etc., what do you think about the Greenland debacle that may be occurring in the next administration?
I don't think Greenland is going to become a state or property of the U.S. anytime soon. I think that's a pipe dream. But it is, if Greenland continues melting at the rate it has for the last couple of decades, we're going to see the oceans rise, or at least my grandchildren are going to see the oceans rise significantly. I don't know if I'm answering your question. I don't know what else to say about Greenland.
It's been alleged that there's a lot of lithium underneath that permafrost. And as the permafrost starts to melt, it becomes more accessible, and we know people in upper government now who want lithium.
Yeah, well, maybe that's why we're hearing about it then. I wasn't aware of that. A scary thought.
We do have several geopolitics programs coming this winter. If that's an area of interest, I'll shamelessly plug those. I think we've got time for maybe one more question. Does anyone have one more? Otherwise, you can keep your gears turned until March. Okay, well, please join me in thanking Jon Waterman.
Thanks.